You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on shockwaveskullsessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian.
Well, all right, Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast number 24. On this episode, we feature part 2 of the great discussion I had with Max Norman, producer extraordinaire Max Norman, along with David Ellefson from Megadeth and John Bush from Armored Saint, and also former lead singer of Anthrax, of course. We go through the 90s catalog of Max Norman on this podcast. Now, if you listen to the last podcast, which was part 1 of the Shockwave Skull Sessions, we went through the entire 80s, not the entire 80s catalog of Max Norman, but we picked key albums that both John Bush and David Ellefson picked out of Max's catalog. And on this episode, we go through the 90s, starting with the Megadeth albums from Rust in Peace, which of course Max mixed, as well as Countdown to Extinction and Euthanasia. We also go into the whole grunge era of the 90s and to his current work, which he's done a couple albums in the last couple years. So without further ado, man, again, the Shockwave Skull Sessions can be heard on Spreaker. Spreaker's like our main hub, Spreaker.com, and you can also check it out on Spotify, iTunes, which I guess is called Apple Music now. I guess there's no more iTunes. It's just simply Apple Music. Google Play, YouTube, iHeartRadio, and I believe it's also up on SoundCloud. I'm not sure about all the directories, but I know they're on several directories. You can check out our main website at shockwaveskullsessions.com. We got Shockwave Skull Sessions Radio happening on Live 365, and you could tune into all the podcasts on that site as well. Let's get the latest news about the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. And you should also go to your favorite podcast provider and subscribe to it. That way you'll have every episode downloaded right into your hard drive, and write those reviews in as well. And if you do want to send a donation, as I've said before, if you send a donation of $20 or more, we will send you a killer care package worth double that, worth about $40 in great heavy metal swag. So you could PayPal that into our email address, shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com. That is our email as well as our PayPal. With that said, let's get right into part 2 of the great discussion with Max Norman, David Ellefson, and John Bush. Well, what do you guys think? Should we get into the Megadeth records now? Yeah. So, Max, I know you were involved, obviously, with the Rust in Peace record in 1990. Was that just, you mixed that album? Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, Mike, I got
Mike
a call
Klink.
from, Mike Klink was producing it, and I think he got a call from GNR, and he had to go back and start working with them again. I found out, actually, because we were on a PBX a panel last December, and David was on there also, and I finally got to see Mike again. I haven't seen him for decades, actually, and Mellow Mike or whatever they call him, and he did explain that I wasn't the first choice for that mix, and I never, and he wouldn't tell me who it was, but maybe Dave can explain that a little better than I am. I know I went down. I think you guys were at Rumbo in Studio A, and I went down there, and we went into the pool room, and I was just standing there, and Mike just said, keep it fairly raw, and off you go, So
Yeah.
And the only thing that was really a little bit difficult about that was that Mike loves to edit, so a lot of the drum tracks were pieced together out of a lot of different takes. So mixing it was a little bit tough. We had to jump the snare onto different tracks and switch between them because there was a different snare sound, stuff like that. So there was a little bit of technicality going on, but still a very good record, very enjoyable. Came out, it did very well as soon as it came out. I think that was right at the beginning of the big break, So it worked out really well.
David, what was your memories of recording with Max on that album?
Well, Max really became part of the Megadeth family for about almost 5 years. Really from 1990, starting with mixing Rust in Peace through everything that we did through the Euthanasia cycle. So that would have been Rust in Peace, Countdown to Extinction, and Euthanasia. Everything that we did. And that was really through 1995. So that included Rust in Peace, We did a one-off for a Beavis and Butthead movie called it was on Interscope called a song called "Go to Hell."
Right.
Then we did the Countdown to Extinction record. Then during that we did a song called "Angry Again" for Sony, which was an Arnold Schwarzenegger film, The Last Action Hero. And then at the end of that cycle, we ended up doing 2 more songs. Bob Chiappardi came to us to do a Sabbath track for the Nativity in Black album. And Sabbath was very kind of very disjointed at that time. It was before Ozzy came back, of course, and they had their big reunion. So we did Paranoid for that. We did, and I think that session we were actually in doing was under contract for, I think it was, that was the Beavis and Butthead record. That's right. That was the Beavis and Butthead record where we cut the track 99 Ways to Die. And while we were in there, we threw down Paranoid real quick. And it's funny with that because right away I said, why don't we do Paranoid? Because I played it in my bands growing up. And Dave was like, let's try some other ones. And I mean, we literally went through every Sabbath song.
Well, you did Never Say Die, too, didn't you? I remember you did.
But that was later. That was later. And on this session, we went through every one. And then finally at the end, Dave plays the riff to Paranoid. And we all jump in and start playing. And it was like, there it is. And so we ended up doing Paranoid after all. But yeah, then we did the Euthanasia record out here in Phoenix in 94. And then it was during that session that we did Never Say Die. Yeah, we did Strange Ways by Kiss, and I mean, we did, a whole bunch of different B-sides and stuff. So, and then I guess that was probably it, Max, right? I mean, I don't know that we worked much more after that, but Megadeth was a team, and I credit Ron Lafitte, who ironically was the tour manager, I think, for you, John, for Armored Saint on the Wasp Metallica Armored Saint tour. Wasn't he your tour manager, I think, at that time?
He was. That's right. Yeah, that's how it started.
Yep. So,
and he was also a writer of the Headbanger fanzine.
Yes. He was bugging me to manage Megadeth for years. He'd always pull me. He knew the way to Dave was through me, right? So he'd always pull me aside, take me out to dinner, and he worked for a couple small managers, and he worked for Rod Smallwood, who manages Iron Maiden, of course, and it just never seemed to work. And then he went out on his own, and he really got us whipped into shape and got us sobered up and cleaned up so we could get in to do, Rust in Peace. So, fortunately, most of the stuff Max got to work on with us, at least the recordings, were, we were clean, clear-headed, but it was a team, the 4 of us in the band, plus Ron Lafitte managing, Andy Summers, our agent, and Max Norman in the studio. I mean, it was a machine. When we went on tour, Andy handled the touring. When we needed to go in the studio, we just automatically called Max. It just was never even a question. In fact, I think the only thing, remember, Max, you had mixed Rust in Peace, and we were going to do the Countdown record, and we knew this record was important. I mean, really important. This was the next step. I mean, by this point, obviously, Metallica's Black Album was blowing up. Queensryche had the Empire album out, and Silent Lucidity was huge, and so our genre was really hitting its stride. So we knew it was a big record. And I mean, I remember on that record, I think we had talked about maybe Peter Collins. I remember Ron had maybe reached out to, who's the guy that did the Maiden records?
Martin Birch.
Martin Birch. And he didn't.
Sir Martin Birch, actually, yeah.
Yeah, he did. I think he said, Ron was trying to talk him into it, and he's like, he goes, listen, I'm bloody rich and I don't need to do it. So he just like I'm done, And Max's name was always on the list, but it was kind of our only experience with Max at that point was that he had mixed Rust in Peace, and we really got to starting to be really critical about it. Kind of, all right, look, let's enough of just trying to throw darts at at sort of a wish list. Like, who have we worked with that's real? And Max, your name just kept coming back again and again, and I don't know who the other contenders were to mix Rust in Peace. Quite honestly, best I remember, Max, I don't think there was one. The only other guy that was in the mix, really, the only other guy that was in the mix at all when Mike, because it's true, Axl called and Mike had to go back to work with Guns N' Roses to work on the Use Your Illusion albums. which basically he left in the middle of Dave doing overdubs for Rest in Peace. We had drums and bass were done. Dave was doing, I think his rhythms were probably down. Some of the solos had started, and Dave was singing, and suddenly Mike had to leave. And the only other guy that was brought in was Dave Jordan, and just was not the, wasn't the right fix. We sat there for a day or two with him in the studio, and it just wasn't right vibe, It's, when Max was brought in, I'll say this, again, what I said earlier about Max's sort of very tough, robust sound. Megadeth, we are a very anal retentive, very, that saying that our manager came up with years ago, state-of-the-art speed metal band. Max is, dude, you are such a workhorse and very meticulous. I mean, that Countdown record, we scoped and dove so deep on that record in every single possible level. It was unbelievable. So much so that when we came out here to Arizona to do Euthanasia, I remember Max saying, he goes, "Man, we're not doing that again. You guys need to fucking lend your pots and come in here and fucking be a band, man. We're not doing that fucking shit again." and the Euthanasia record is I don't listen to it that much, but when I do, it's one of my favorite records that we've made as Megadeth, because that's us playing in a room together. I mean, that's us. I remember we would do 3 takes of every song, and we'd pick the best one, and then we'd carve in and we'd punch in any little mistakes or anything, and then we would just move on. And sometimes we'd do 2 or 3 tracks a day, and I think we got most of the basic tracks of that record done in like a week or 10 days or so. And that was after Max had, on the CAD on his computer, drafted the design for the control room and 2 ISO rooms, and then brought Mick Zane out from Malice and his team, and they built the studio. So if I could just tell one story, and then I'll turn it over to Max. Is funny. In '93, we had a break on the Countdown to Extinction tour, and I was writing a bunch of songs with a friend of Nick Menzies, this guy Pat Chunk. And I got the idea to have John Bush sing on a song, and I think through Ron Lafitte, we got a hold of you, John. And you came over and sang on this demo called "If You Were God" that I actually is coming out on my album, My Sleeping Giants. And I remember I brought that song into the Euthanasia sessions to consider. And I remember, Max, we sat and we listened to it, and you made the comment. You go, it's really good, but it kind of has this Billy Idol groove about it, and I just don't think that's really what we're going for on this record. So John, I championed the song, so I'm putting it out regardless if Max thinks it has a Billy Idol.
That's hilarious. That rules.
So, yeah, literally, when you hear the song, that's John Bush at 10 in the morning. Cobwebs in his voice, eye boogers from just waking up. I mean, he literally came over to Pat's apartment on, on Colfax, I think, right?
I totally remember that.
You were so kind to come over, and you're still asleep. You're not even awake, and we're like, "Hey, if you can sing it like this, and here's the lyrics," and you just opened your mouth and fucking roared like a lion, man. I was just like, Jesus, this guy's amazing.
Thank you. That's funny. Well, it's funny, those Megadeth records. I mean, obviously, beginning of Rest in Peace, and then Countdown and Euthanasia. I mean, that's what catapulted you guys to a whole nother level, and everything that a lot of people aspired to do that you guys achieved, which was awesome. So, I mean, for Max to be part of that, and begin with the mixing and then following into the producing of those next couple of records, that cements your legacy right there. I mean, if you never did another record, Max, just those Megadeth records alone would be enough for you to be a metal legend. Not taking anything away from anything else you've done, including Ozzy. But I mean, the Megadeth records are ones that, you were just such a part of, I'm sure, from point A to point B, and from all, from all that in between. It's just, it's cool that's such an enormous aspect of your history.
They were a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun doing those records, that's for sure. I think we all learned a lot of stuff, and that's really what it's all about is, every time you make a record, you learn new stuff. It really is a learning process, and that's what we always try to do. And the whole thing is try to make the best possible record at the time, and that's really what everybody's about. And Megadeth at that time really was a very, very good band. Everybody were very, very good players. Marty, of course. I just saw Marty with his band out in Chicago not too long ago.
Yeah, they're amazing.
With the girl bass player.
Yeah.
Really, really great playing, and there wasn't too much egos going on there. It was really everybody kind of pitching in and trying to make it, the best possible record. And those I think create the best possible records. There wasn't too much strife going on. There wasn't too much politics. Everybody was just trying to, get it right and make it really good. So yeah, they were great learning experiences, and great experiences all around, of course.
Yeah, and I'll say this, that, when we went in to do Countdown, we did 2 sessions. We wrote some songs on the Clash of the Titans tour. We wrote about half of the album there. We came home. We went into the EMI Music Publishing Studio on Sunset, and Ryan Green, who's now kind of a power pop punk producer, he was the engineer. He laid those songs down. We went to the power plant up on Sherman Way there in North Hollywood, and he basically wrote the second half, which was songs like Symphony of Destruction and Sweating Bullets and stuff like that. And then I remember, Max, that's when we brought you in. And I think for us in the band and with Ron, with management, it was okay. Like this is an album that doesn't just need to sound good, which we knew Max could do. This is an album that really needs songs. Like these songs really have to go to another level. And I think, Max, that was the thing. That was that moment as a band, like, who do we trust? Because if this doesn't work, we're fucked. I mean, we'll just be a club and theater level thrash band for the rest of our career. But if we really do this right, we could go up into the arenas, and this could really be change our lives forever. One of the things you did with them, not only working with Dave on singing, like kind of falling off notes and different things that I remember. He still to this day comments about how you sort of worked with him on the vocals on that. Some techniques that Joe Elliott had, I think, that you had talked to him about. But also, I remember Symphony of Destruction was like almost 6 minutes long, right? Because it had like 2 guitar solos, a bass solo, 3 verses, 3 choruses. And I remember one of my favorite memories of the Countdown session was one day, I think the record was mixed, and Max, you told us, you said, all right, everybody get out of here. Get the hell out of here. Leave me alone. I need a whole day by myself. And you literally threw us out of the studio at the Enterprise. And you chopped down Symphony of Destruction into the 3-minute, essentially, pop hit that it became. Just by editing and getting rid of all of this stuff. It's kind of like the Michelangelo statue of David, just getting rid of everything that's not to be there. And you really had an incredible knack at being able to do that, to really kind of see the song amidst all the fluff and all the bullshit that might be around it. And to me, dude, that is a sign of just an amazing instinct that you have as a producer that, that's, like John said, it forever cemented you as really, some of our biggest years ever with the band.
Well, is there a version of that? Is there a version of that with that's not edited?
There might be.
It might be sometime.
It might be on one of the, and I should know this, but it might be on one of the
box sets?
Remastered, remastered re-releases, or on War Chest or something, like one of these, because we pretty much cleaned the vaults out of damn near everything. So
that'd be cool to hear that.
Yeah. So it's and it's funny, the tuning thing that you mentioned, Max, on the Malice record. Always in the studio, you have one guitar tech. He tunes all the guitars for everybody. So even if he tunes them out of tune, at least you're all out of tune together. Which makes you sound in tune. And one day, I remember, Max, we were doing bass. Nick had put the drums down. I was doing bass, and then I just said, fuck it, I got this. I'll just tune it myself. And I did, and I remember I had to come back in and re-record the bass, because then as Dave tried to put guitars down, it wasn't in tune. You had the same problem, only instead of being able to blame the tape machine, this time you got to blame the bass player, me, because I tuned the bass myself.
Yeah, well, I think we made the mistake of not having some sort of other instrument in there to listen to, and we were probably just listening to the bass and drums and concentrating on being accurate timing wise, and not realizing that the low E was like flat or sharp or whatever it was. So and bass is a little tricky, because depending on how hard you hit it, it depends on how in tune it is. So that was the other thing that we had to kind of be very careful about. And that tuning is always a real pain in the ass that you got to keep an eye on. And we probably just did not have a guitar in there where we should have had a guitar in there where we would have heard it straight away. And I remember, Dave got very irate about that. And and we had to come back in and recut some stuff, and we even had a guy out in the back room on the synclavier actually tune up one of them, I think.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, I learned probably the most stuff that I've learned in my recording career. I learned from making the records that we did with you, Max. Just things about timing. Remember on Euthanasia, I started using Dave's pick, which is it's a gauge lighter than the ones that I normally use, the yellow ones instead of the green ones. And I started using those to just kind of get me back a little bit behind the beat, because the tunes were a little more kind of butterfly picking, a little more groovier. A lot of stuff with timing and just sort of the things to listen to when you're recording and tuning. And I mean, there's just so much, man, that I became such a better bass player and recording musician, just because of our years that we worked together, man. I mean, thank you for that. You ultimately changed me as a musician, and you changed my career, man. So thank you.
Yeah, there was some funny. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, there's some quite interesting things. I know that when we started doing that bass, you were standing next to me at the console, and I was like kind of a little quizzical, and I'm like, something's going on here, and we were trying to figure out what was going on with the kick against the bass, and part of it was the picking that you were doing, and I think you were double picking because you were hitting your thumbnail and the pick at one point.
Right.
So we messed around with that a little bit, and then I'm still like looking at him quizzically and going, what the fuck? And so and I had a computer at that point that we could throw waveforms into, so we threw it in there, and we took a look at the bass track against the kick drum, and I said, look, you're about 10 milliseconds in front of the kick all the time. I said, so that's cool. I said, go to the back of the room, which was about 10 feet further back from where David was standing next to the console. And then we started to put it down like that, and he was smacking right on the bass, right on the kick drum. So that was kind of an interesting little sort of out of the box kind of, fit.
Well, and I think you put that together because you realized live, you knew how the distance I stood from Nick live, and that's where the pocket was. So being in the studio, I wouldn't normally, as much as I was sitting by you at the console, I wouldn't normally be sitting that close to the sound source. So because most of my work at that point was really road work, and live work, and we just come off the road into the studio. And guys have different, you're as a musician, your chops and your ear, you listen differently when you're in the studio all the time versus if you're out on the road. Because on the road you listen to things differently. You're listening to sound sources from monitors in front of you, the side fills beside you, the back line behind you. So there's all these different sources that you listen to, and of course the live drum kit on the stage. And Max, I think you put that together just going, where have you normally been listening to Nick Menza? Not 5 feet from him. Yeah. So you said, okay, just stand 15 feet from him like you normally would. And that's when it just locked right in. The pocket was there. So it's like, yeah, that was just clever stuff on the fly like that.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. Yeah, I don't even know if we thought about it at the time. I think it was just like, we just realized that you were a little in front. So we just moved you further away from the speaker. So, and it's 1 foot a millisecond. So we figured, okay, 10 more feet, you should be right in the pocket. And then I think later on we went, oh, yeah, that's because he stands 15 feet away from Nick on stage. And, that's what you got used to doing. So, all those kind of things. We found lots and lots of little tricks and crazy stuff like that throughout making those records. I remember that, yeah.
Wow.
Sounds pretty logical.
Yeah.
Yep.
I want to interject something just as a fan. I'm not an artist and I'm not a producer, but I think all of us as fans, except that David had said how the producer is a part of the family, is like a 5th or 6th member of the band. And, growing up, we all knew who produced what album, whether it be a Martin Birch or Ted Templeman or Max Norman or, it was just something we all remember. Oh, so-and-so produced that. And each producer, even though, like I said, I wasn't an artist or a producer, but these producers had a sound and they were such a big part of the band in those days. Whereas now I think people have just forgot about the art of production. And I mean, you take something like the first Van Halen album, you listen to some of those old live tapes of Van Halen, or even the demos that Gene Simmons did and anything like that. It was like that wouldn't have done probably nothing near as what the album did with Ted Templeman. He really honed them down. He honed down David Lee Roth. I mean, if you listen to the live stuff, Dave was like spitting out, wow, and every other word. I'm sure in the studio I said, Dave, no, do it here and do it here. And when you listen to that album, it's like perfect. And that's all the producer. And I think people don't give the producers really enough credit as far as not just the sound they get, but honing the band into what is going to be a successful album. You are the ears of what is going to make this song a hit, or is going to really carry this song sonically. And I always go through like the Judas Priest catalog, and you think about how their 70s albums were very progressive, and the sound that Dennis McKay did with Stained Class, or even Roger Glover did with Sin After Sin. It's a very thin guitar kind of sound, not big drums, but it was more, you had Simon Phillips, you had Les Binks, very jazz fusion-y players. So you hear the drums so good. You can't have a wall of guitar sounds on that. So in the 70s, that worked. But then a whole new decade in the 80s comes, and it's a kind of a whole new sound. You got the new wave of British heavy metal. You got Back in Black. You got, a Sabbath, Heaven and Hell, kind of this new sound. And of course, with British Steel, they get a new drummer coming in, Dave Holland, and they do more of a 4/4, wall of guitar sound with British Steel, completely different than the 70s. But it was a producer, Tom Allen, that had this sound that changed. It's like it welcomed in the 80s. And then even in the 90s with Chris Tangarides, when he did Painkiller, that was a new sound, and you had, this new guitar sound of Pantera and Prong, Terry Date, all these. It brought in a new decade to a new sound, and that was all had to do with the producer, I think. And a lot of people, especially in this day of age, from the 2000s on, there hasn't been anything new or exciting production-wise, or anything that took it to the next level. Do you guys understand what I'm saying and agree, or?
Well, I will say this. I'll say that if you listen to a lot of bands, and I certainly don't want to be somebody who sounds like an old fogey by any means, but I think that sometimes what's missing in more modern groups is just more distinction of the bands themselves. Not saying that there's not a lot of talented people, because there certainly is, obviously, and a lot of people are very successful. But I think that the key is always to just try to bring out the uniqueness and the originality of the musicians through the albums. And producers, that's their thing, is to take this band and then make that band sound like that band. And then that band can sound like a different band than this band and that band. And you could still be under the same umbrella genre of heavy metal, but sound so different. And I think that's what everybody should strive to do and want to do, is to have their own unique trip. And producers are a part of making that happen. So, just Max alone, talking about all these records, they all sound very different than each other. And that's, again, hats off to him to make that happen. It doesn't sound like all those bands kind of sound the same. They don't. They all sound very different. I mean, come on, Loudness to Megadeth, I mean, to Blizzard of Oz. I mean, it's pretty diverse. So I think that's the key, is to really take the band, embellish their sound and their originality. And Max did that well, incredibly.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's really what you're supposed to be doing. And I think the problem nowadays is not so much that people aren't doing that, but that there's no real production in the early stages. And when we were making these records, of course, we did extensive pre-production. You worked on the arrangements before you even got into the studio. There was a lot of rehearsals. You made sure that the two guitar players knew what each other was doing, which they probably didn't realize when they were playing these things live. And they go, "Oh, is that what you're playing? Oh shit!" And then you could work through all these things to say, "Look, this is not going to work. You guys got to do do one this way, one this way." All of these little things that you could work on, they'll probably get glossed over these days, and people just get in there. And the other thing that I think is really important, and I've mentioned this a few times to other producers, and as far as the live sort of feel goes, a lot of music really depends on the backwards and forwards interplay between players. And it has that sort of certain something that you don't really know what it is, but it just makes it sort of alive and sort of becomes something more than just, four guys playing. And unfortunately, what happens, first of all, it used to be that all the guys would play at once, and then you'd have the record, and then of course it got to, oh well, we can make it a little better if we only do the bass and drums, and then we do the guitars later. But at that point, it's the 100% interplay is now dropped to 50% because the bass and drums aren't going to play back to the guitars. It's just the guitars playing to these bass and drums. So the adjustments are only being made on the guitar players, not being made by the whole band anymore. And I see that as a less of a conversation between the players, and correspondingly a more difficult thing to get to come together, if you understand what I mean. There's a little less glue going on. So it becomes somewhat harder to make an organic sounding record where everybody sounds like they're really all, pumping the same tune. As it evolved, as recording evolved, and now, of course, people are really just phoning their parts in. So it's almost it's almost even less of an interplay between bands, and it's a lot harder to make records like that. You have to really concentrate on whether it feels right, and it's possible to miss whether it feels right, and it's possible to put something down, and then later on, when you're half listening to it, you go, that doesn't feel that good. It's a very difficult, it's a very ephemeral thing. And that's so much easier when everybody just plays the song and walks out, and you're like, yeah, and you take it with the mistakes, you take it with the changes in tempos and the kind of little errors, and that's what makes it. I mean, if you listen to early Led Zeppelin, that's what we're talking about. There's some of them are pretty horrendous mistakes in there Jimmy Page is making, but he didn't care. He said, "That's it. I'm moving on," and they become sort of legendary because of these sort of it's like the mole on the model's face, all these little parts that become part of the character of the thing. And I take what John says. I think it's very accurate that because you're removing this character and everybody wants to make, more and more perfect records, more and more great sounding records, that a lot of this character is starting to get removed. And as the character gets removed, everybody starts to use the same reverb plugins, and everybody's doing it. Well, a lot of people are doing it in the box, at least until they get to mix. Things do start sounding pretty similar. It's like, I'm going to use a line 6 for my guitar. I'm not going to use a big Marshall, or I'm going to use a Kemper, guitar modeling, or all of these different things. But they tend to produce a sameness in the end result, and that converges into sort of a lot of bands sounding very similar. I see a lot of bands in the early 2000s through 2015 coming out of Sweden, for instance, and they have a lot of AOR bands, and they have a lot of these what they call progressive, prog power bands.
Right. And
a lot of these bands, I mean, there's like 100 of them, and I could not tell you which one is which unless I know which song it is, because they are very, very similar. And I think that's one of the things you're talking about is it becomes much, much harder to get that individualistic aspect out. And that, of course, is what we're always looking for. We're always looking for something. You're looking for something that if you hear 5 seconds, you know what band it is.
Absolutely.
And that's much, much harder to do these days, unless you just get in there with the whole band and then you get the signature. But if you don't do that, it's very, very difficult to do these days, I think.
Let me ask you something, Max. In the case of, say, a band like Megadeth, that we're doing something so completely new in hard rock and metal, this thing called thrash metal, and even something different than, Metallica and Anthrax and Slayer at the time. They were kind of, carrying on with the new wave of British heavy metal bands did, just kind of speed it up. But Megadeth added this unique jazz fusion, especially on their earlier records. And that must have been very difficult because you're producing a whole new genre. So it's something new for the producer as well as the bands. And you want to kind of capture it. Like, you listen to Killing Is My Business, and it's a difficult thing to produce because it doesn't sound like a metal record. It's so clean, and it just doesn't really work. And then, so far so good, so what? There was so much reverb on the drums and this and that. But I think when you came in, again, you honed the band down into what became what I really consider the true Megadeth sound. But how much input could you have, or do you risk to have? Because it's got to be a risk in doing something new. And I bring up the example with Bob Rock doing the Saint Anger record. You know, they obviously wanted to try something new that they thought, wow, this could be a whole new, I don't know what they were thinking, but it could be a whole new genre of metal or of production. And it obviously didn't really work for Metallica, but it is always kind of that risk in working with a band that is so completely unique to, you know, what had been done previously in the 80s or 70s. Did you come across that, or did that enter your mind at all, Max, when working with Megadeth?
Well, of course, you always enjoy hearing something that's got that, you know, uniqueness, and that was certainly there. I remember Dave sent me, this is an old story, but I'll tell it really quickly. Dave sent me, I guess while you were in the process of throwing those darts at the list of producers, the dart ended up on my name, and Dave sent me a cassette with all of those tracks that you put down. Didn't really have any vocals on it. And I remember he sent me this cassette, and I listened to it for a couple of days, and I didn't have any clue really what to do with it at all. And I thought, well, I'm kind of screwed here. I really don't know what to do. And then I think on the third or fourth day, I got out of bed, and I thought, well, I'm going to listen to this one more time. And if I don't have any ideas, then I'm just going to have to say, well, I don't really, you know, I'm not the right guy. So I just listened to it again, and all of a sudden, I was listening to one of the tracks, and I said, you know what, that bit's way too fucking long. I got to take that out. And then be like, well, yeah, that's, you know, this is actually really good. Let's expand this bit a little bit, and let's see if we can't, you know, let's see if we can't make something more out of that. And all of a sudden, I had a much more of an insight, and I guess I just hadn't listened to it enough, and I just didn't understand it. And then I started to understand it, and I wrote out about 4 or 5 pages of notes, and I sent them over to Dave, and there was a deafening silence for a few days. And I thought, well, there goes that. You know, he probably thinks I'm a total arsehole, you know. And then I got a phone call from Dave, and he said, I got your notes. And there was this big, long pause. And I was like, yeah, okay. And he said, well, I agree with about 98% of it. So, and I was like, oh, okay. I was expecting him to say, you suck, see ya, you know. But he said, no, he said, I agree with 98% of it. You know, let's do it. So it really was the lesson that I learned then, and which has always kind of stayed with me, was that if I didn't know what to do, I didn't do anything. But then if I did know what to do, then I would put it forward and say, look, this is what I think we should do here. And I would only do that if I was convinced that it was the right thing to do. And I think that goes back again to a lot of the stuff we were talking about on that producer panel last year down in Florida, where people were asking us, you know, what's the best thing for a producer? And my answer was always truth. You always got to tell the truth. Nobody wants you to say, yeah, that's great every time. You know, if it ain't great, you say, well, you know, it's okay, but it's not great. I think this is not right and this is not right. And, you know, people want accurate feedback, and they want the truth. Nobody wants a yes man in the studio. It doesn't produce good records. It doesn't make any sense. And I think Dave was very accommodating in that way, because he understood that I was genuine about it. And I said, look, you know, I just don't think this part's good. So I think we should just get rid of it. And for the most part, he was very conducive. And he said, yeah, okay. You know, so we did work together very well on those records. And he was very open to any of these suggestions. And obviously it paid off, you know. So I think that's really the whole thing. If you don't know what to do, keep listening until you do know what to do. And I always thought about Mutt Lange and the fact that he spent so long making these records, like, you know, Pyromania and stuff like that. And I thought, you know what? This guy's listened to this record more times than anybody on the planet is ever going to listen to him. And what he's done is he's removed anything that he doesn't like. And he's found things that after 400 listens, he's finally found something. Oh, yeah, I don't like that anymore. And he's gone, okay, we're going to take that out. And it's sort of like Sherlock Holmes, you know, when you've eliminated everything that's not true, what you're left with is the answer. And that's how I've always worked with production, is to try to remove stuff that I didn't like. And when you do that, eventually you end up with everything that you do like. And then hopefully, if you've got a good, you know, head on your shoulders and you're musical enough, that ends up being the right thing to do, you know.
That's cool.
Wow.
That's awesome.
You know, one thing I do want to mention, shortly after I guess it was, after Countdown, I think you did Visual Lies by Lizzie Borden. And I remember talking to Lizzie and mentioning what you're saying here, Max, is, when Lizzie Borden always kind of did this Iron Maiden, like power metal meets Halloween kind of real fast sound. And they said when they went in the studio with you, you said, dude, slow it down. It'll be so much more effective. And Lizzie says they were very hesitant at the time. And then they listened to you and did the recordings with it. And they heard, like Me Against the World, which was a big chant song. And they said, wow, this really works. So they understood that, hey, maybe, because I think a lot of bands are very stubborn about no producer's going to change our sound. This is our sound. But then once they realize, hey, this actually works because they're trying something different.
And that is an interesting point. And as I started to work through more of these records, I realized that one of the things that's very important is tempo, and to be tempo conscious. And I think that was the first album that when we were rehearsing that record, I had a very strict way of rehearsing. We would always rehearse the slowest song first, and then move up to the next slowest song and the next slowest song, because it's very difficult to play a slow song after you've played a very fast song. And it's very difficult to pin that tempo down. So I tried to instill tempo, what we call tempo consciousness, into the whole proceedings. And then we would put down some roughs and we'd go and play pool. And I say, look, don't listen to it. Just put it on in the background, but don't listen to it. And if you're starting to tap your foot and not really listening, then you're in the ballpark. Now you're in the right, you've got the groove going, you know what I mean? So that's really kind of what we did with that. That's kind of what we did with Euthanasia. I got a lot of flack about that record for it being too slow. A lot of people didn't like it. But actually, I think what happened with Euthanasia was it actually grabbed a different audience as well as a lot of the hardcore fans. A lot of hardcore fans didn't like it, but then a lot of other people really did like it. And there's quite a lot of people out there that I meet these days who are maybe a little younger, who like that record much more than they like Countdown. And then I meet people who are older who don't like Euthanasia at all, but love Countdown. So, it's all about, what seemed to happen at the time, really. But, Lizzie, that was an interesting record. Of course, with Joe Holmes playing guitar, great guitar player. Yeah, that was a very cool record.
All right. Well, into the 90s, you did quite a bit. I know in 1990, you did a George Lynch's solo record, Wicked Sensation. You did a band called Mind Bomb. You did I believe Death Angel Act 3 in 1990 as well. That was a big year for you, 90. And I know you actually passed on the Pantera, Cowboys from Hell, to do the Wicked Sensation album by George Lynch. Talk a little bit about that record.
Yeah, I spoke to that. I spoke to the guys last week about that. Yeah,
right.
Derek Shulman sent me down to Texas to see this band. They were absolutely phenomenal. I mean, I was really floored when I saw them. The hair was standing up on the back of my neck. I was like, holy shit, with Phil singing and Daryl. And I mean, it was just an amazing band, And I got back to New York and I said, yeah, what do you want to know? I said, they're great. What do you want to know? He said, well, do you want to do the record? I said, sure. But I said, I'm not going to do the record unless I have management. I didn't have any management at the time. And at the time, in those days, it was really a bad idea to do a record with a record company if the band didn't have representation, because they would get shoved around by the record company and they might not get tour support and, all these other different things. So one of the rules I had about the business at that time was unless they had realistic management, then I really wasn't going to go near there, because often it would fail at the back, at the back end. It wouldn't get enough support. It wouldn't get enough airplay. They would change A&R people, and then, the new A&R guy, it wasn't his record, so he'd be like, forget that noise. So I said to him, look, they got to get management. And he said, oh, all right, well. And then I called my manager, and at the time, Andy Gould, and said, hey, this band is amazing. You should manage them. And so he ended up managing them for a while. And in the meantime, I was getting calls from, I forget who was calling me. It might have been Lippman Kahane or it might have been George. And I knew George from before quite a few times, met him quite a few times, and always been a big fan of his playing, of course. And it really came to sort of a toss-up at the end. And there was a couple of other factors that came in. Vinny wanted to do the record, the Pantera record, down at his place, which was a little bit ramshackle for me. And I was used to having a somewhat better studio that I could work in, a little more easily. That was one of the factors, and a couple of other things just conspired, so it just ended up to being almost like a toss of the coin. And I went with George to do George's record, and then, and of course, Neil Kernan actually and I were co-producing on that record when it started. It was an enormous, biggest budget record I ever did. I think it was about $750,000, that record. So,
wow.
It was just, we were in a massive place, one-on-one in North Hollywood. Right down the street from Tokyo Delve, which I think just burnt down a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I just read about that.
Yeah, that sucked. But we used to go to Tokyo Delve and drink sake, and then we'd go back and lay some tracks down and stuff like that. And that was a really great record. I had Mick Brown on a drum riser. I had a 30 kilowatt PA in there and really loud in there. And that's how we got that real big drum sound. And of course, George worked very, very hard on all the solos. He had his teacher down there every day. The only difficult part was really to try and get the vocals going. And of course, you probably heard all the stories about Oni and how I lifted 5 of the vocals off of the 8-track that they'd made previously, and retuned them and retimed them and dropped them into the main album, because I was freaking out that I wouldn't have any vocals at the end of the day. So I think about 4 or 5 of the vocals on that record are from the original 8-track. So there was a lot of work. We spent a lot of work on George's solos.
So George had a guitar teacher in there, Max?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was there most of the time. Yeah, he was.
Like, who was he? Like a classical guy? Like, what kind of a teacher did he have?
I don't know. Well, he was. He might well have been a classical guy, but he was mostly working on the solos. They were writing the solos. That, I think, was a really key part of that record. Some of his solos on that record are just out of this world. I mean, I'm just like, holy shit. What's that one on? Street Fighting Man, the solo on that. I mean, the stuff was like, my hair would just be falling out. I'd be like, holy shit, this is amazing stuff. And George at that time, I think, may well have been at his peak. I've seen him recently, and he's a little looser, and he's a little more blues oriented now, and he's not so much into that style of playing, but just an amazing player, and it was a really an eye-opening record to make. And I think we ended up with a really great sounding record. We had a great sounding kit. George sounded really good on it. We ended up getting really good vocals. So, I was very pleased with that record. I mean, hopefully so, as it cost almost $750,000. But,
Wow.
And then Death Angel, we're talking about Death Angel.
Sure.
What an incredible band they are. And I just saw those guys actually out in Los Angeles.
Yeah, they're still playing.
Yeah, and they are just, once again, another phenomenal band. Again, they disappeared for some years, and then they got the band back together, and it's just Rob Calvestani and Mark now from the original band. But it was great to see those guys. I saw them down at the Whiskey about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and they were just unbelievably good. I mean, he's singing a little more of the gruff vocals now, but really, really an amazing band, great drummer. I mean, just phenomenal band. So when we made that record, that was just another eye-opener for a totally different reason. Just the arrangements and stuff on there were just unbelievably, crazy. And I'd never seen that kind of expertise in such a young band before. It was really an eye-opener. I was like, holy cow, these guys are really, really good. So that album turned out pretty good, and they never called me back. I don't know why. Maybe they were just doing something else. I don't know. But I told them, call me back. I told them 4 weeks ago.
I know you worked with a band called Phantom Blue, the Built to Perform record in 93. Geffen Records shelved that album, and I thought that was a great album. It was their follow-up album, and I know Geffen had no interest in the band at the time. How frustrating is it for you when you put all this work and effort into a band, a great band, and then you see that the record ends up getting shelved? Does that happen to a lot of your bands?
I don't know if it was shelved, but it was a very limited release, I think.
Right.
And then they just dumped it. So,
yeah, it did come out. You're right.
For some reason, I never had much luck with Geffen. That was Tom Zutaut. And I had a little run-in with him previously to that some years before. He flew me into L.A. to talk to, what the hell's the name of the band? Tesla. And right. I flew into L.A., and then he said, I'm not going to be there for another week. So I flew out again because I didn't have the time, and he got kind of pissed off about that, I think. And but he promised Tesla that I would show up. So eventually I did go up to up North San Francisco, I guess. And I rehearsed with the band one day, and we did Susie's on the Up, and I went through and changed all the arrangement and worked through it with them, and we had a great time. And then I left the next day, and I never got called back for that one either. So I guess that was down to Tom just, looking after the band and going, fuck you. But, whatever. I actually do talk to Tom these days anyway. But, it's just one of those things that happened. And I guess, I don't know who did that record. Was it Wagner did it?
But Michael, it was the two guys.
Barbieri?
Yeah, Barbieri.
Yeah, Steve Thompson, Michael Barbieri.
Right.
I talk to Steve all the time. Yeah, I talk to him online. Yeah, I mean, those were another set of guys that were in that same genre, doing all that kind of stuff. They're excellent too, and they made an excellent records. No skin off my nose, but these things happen, and there's a lot. There's people out there, and sometimes you get the gig, sometimes you don't.
Was there any other things you wanted to mention, John or David, before we jump into more recent 2016 and finish up here? I know, David, you had mentioned Mind Bomb, or were there any other records throughout the 90s that you wanted to touch on?
Well, I just remember, Max, you played me the Mind Bomb record you had done when we were sitting there. It was probably after hours while we were doing the Euthanasia record. And you had just put it on. You said, hey, you might want to give this a listen. And I remember you played it, and it was amazing because it was it was a very ahead of its time, forward-thinking record. I mean, kind of almost like that day's version of, I guess, a great kind of funk metal type of record, but done almost in the way that like today's probably EDM record would sound, right? I just couldn't believe how advanced it was, especially because on the Euthanasia record, we had tried to use multi-track Pro Tools to record the album, and the machines kept glitching. We'd start playing, say, Train of Consequences. We'd get up to like the first chorus, and then the whole apparatus would just lock up. And then we'd have to take an hour to reset it. And so finally we ended up just going and recording the whole album on the Sony 48-track digital tape. But that's why I remember, Max, with Pro Tools, because at that point Pro Tools was pretty much just a 2-track editing mechanism. It wasn't really used for multi-track recording yet until, I don't know, a couple years later. So when I heard that Mind Bomb record, I was just blown away by, to me, I always called it like the ultimate producer's record, because there's no way a band could physically play that good because of how good you made it. It just blew me away. When I saw it on the list, I was like, that was a cool record. I remember you playing.
Yeah, it was an interesting record. There's a guy called Matt who wrote most of that record in Chicago, and we ended up making that record. And that was another one where the A&R situation changed right when we got to the end of the record, and it basically got no support at all, and it kind of just disappeared. But it was an interesting record. Like you say, the music itself was very advanced, I thought, and that really sort of lended itself towards that kind of production. But I sadly didn't really do anything. I think it got a little bit. "Can You See Me?" I think was a big track. That got a little bit of airplay and stuff like that. But yeah, that was that Electra? Maybe I think it was Electra. But that was another one where the actual business side of it just sort of fell apart. And I remember those guys that managed Mind Bomb at the time are now like the biggest management company in the planet. I think those two guys. I forget their names, but they're huge now, and they've got like fingers in everything, and they're doing movies and all kinds of stuff. But at that time, I think that was their main focus. But yeah, I don't know what happened really. It all kind of fell apart, and it didn't get any support, and the drummer left, and it was all down to sort of, I don't know. I don't know what happened to Matt. I think he's still out there somewhere in Chicago, maybe. I don't know. But he was a kind of metal hip hop guy actually, which is like really odd, So it was hard to work out what box to put that in. But I'm not very good with boxes. People tell me, oh, that's not power metal, that's speed metal, or that's death metal, or there's so many genres now. I try not to put stuff in boxes because I think that's a little bit can be a bit fatal, when you're trying to make something, to end up with a box that it should fit in,
Something totally off topic, but I do remember when you were talking about Euthanasia and Pro Tools and all that, how that was when a lot of things were changing technology-wise. I recall going to your party. It was a Halloween night for Euthanasia. Amazing party. And I remember talking to you, and you were online chatting with people overseas, and you were you were actually playing games and stuff with people online, and I'm like freaking out because this was the first time I had heard of this, and you basically introduced me to social media. So I just wanted to let you know, thank you for that. And I was like so stunned. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? You're like, yeah, this guy's in France and this guy's in, and I'm like, wow, this is crazy.
Well, again, Megadeth, we always embraced technology. In fact, if for any reason the earlier records didn't sound good, it's just simply because we didn't have the money. It was never for a lack of a desire. As much as, we talk about these organic sounding records, I think it was always our desire to make the most sort of militant, metallic, just freaking perfect, precise records we could, to a fault maybe, and I think that's why the Euthanasia record was a little bit of a pushback against that. And then that was largely driven by Max. He's like, look, you guys are a great band. You should go and record as a band, not do this. Well, Max, I love how you say conversation, because imagine if this three-way podcast was all done individually. That's the equivalent of doing overdubs, is a conversation when the other guys aren't even in the room. And that's
pretty much like that. Yeah, it's the same sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah,
so it's very impersonal. Because you got all these knobs and levers and gadgets and meters, it's very intimidating as well. It's not a musical setting being in the studio, because it's a sound laboratory is what it is, and you get used to it, of course, making records over the years. But so, yeah, I mean, we tried to use, again, to be the advanced band on the cutting edge. We tried to use Pro Tools. It just was not ready yet. But I remember Capitol Records flying out to meet us, and around the feet, we all met out in Phoenix at the studio that Max had built in this warehouse just west of downtown Phoenix. And they came out and they said, we want to launch the record around this new technology called the World Wide Web. And we're like, well, what is the World Wide Web? And they're like, we don't really know, but we think it's going to be big. This thing called the internet, right? And so, of course, me and Dave, we were like, yeah, let's do it. Let's get on board. And, that's when they built the whole Hollywood and Vine Megadeth Arizona website, which was extremely cumbersome. I mean,
I remember that. Yeah.
Right. It was basically, they built it like it was an old Western town, and but that Bob, at the release party, which I guess was probably October, 25 years ago, walk into this, and then back in those days, the major labels they'd spend money flying you around the world. We all went in different directions doing big press campaigns.
That was one of the best parties, one of the best release parties.
Yeah. And they had, I'll never forget that room. They said, hey, David, would you come over here and chat with some fans on the computer? And I was like, what the hell is that? And so I remember going in there and doing it and like typing. Of course, I can type well. And I remember typing to some fans. I think Sweden was the very first person to respond back. And to me, it's really lame. Now we do it all the time. We text. I mean, it's how we freaking communicate, is through typing and texting and chats and all this stuff. At the time, I was like, this is so lame, man. It's like, why don't you just pick up the phone and talk to somebody, And
I still feel that way.
Right? That's why we're all on a phone call right now, right? But you're right. That record, Euthanasia, it's funny, as much as musically Max pushed us back to just, you guys need to be four guys in a room playing, as much as we got more organic in our sort of just being a band. It's interesting. It was really the downbeat and launch of a huge technological advancement for us in the band, for the music business. I mean, Megadeth, we had the very first band website ever. And that was, thank God, Capitol Records, they were ahead of the curve, and they saw the future of this worldwide web.
Awesome story. John Bush, are you still with us?
I'm here.
All right.
I'm listening. I'm enjoying listening.
Talk about some of the 90s albums that, that either Max had done or that you were doing at the time production-wise. And, give us some input here, John Book.
What, you mean records that I was enjoying and listening to?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was, obviously I was a huge fan of the bands that came out of Seattle, and especially Soundgarden and, Alice in Chains. And I was a huge fan of Faith No More. I'm still a fan of all these bands, and, they kind of ushered in a whole new trip. And that's when I joined Anthrax. And we were trying to kind of, we were embracing being a band of the 90s, because the 80s were amazing. and everything was cool, but it was a new it was a new decade, and it was a lot of new things going on, and you know, I wasn't resisting it, I was embracing it. So I think that, you know, it again, there's all these bands that came from that time that, you know, kind of took music in a different direction, and that was a great thing. And it was, you know, just broadening the style of hard rock and heavy metal, and the talent was just off the charts, and bands again sounded like their unique selves. And I think that, you know, I touched on it earlier, so I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I mean, I think it was just about, you know, creating a uniqueness. That is the kind of thing that will always kind of make bands much more legendary, is just having this unique character flowing through the bassist and the guitarist and certainly the vocals. I mean, you could take the big four bands, and, you know, the beauty of all those bands being, you know, part of a certain genre. Megadeth, Metallica, Anthrax of the 80s, and Slayer all sound...
You're breaking up here, John. Are you there, John?
He must have gone to get tacos.
John getting his tacos. But, you know, that is interesting. Well, before John comes back, did you get a lot of pressure or feel a lot of pressure from either labels or maybe management, Max? Because the 90s, again, you know, talking about a whole new decade, brought in a new sound of grunge, you know, and alternative music. Did you have any pressure to change your production style at all to fit in with the 90s sound, Max?
No, not really. Basically, people stopped asking me to do records, basically. So, you know, you get hot for a while, and then you're not so popular, and then new people come on the scene, and the whole grunge thing changed everything quite radically. So, you know, I worked for a little while longer in the field, and then I you know, had my young children that were growing up, so I got out of there for a while. And it's only about the last 4 or 5 years that I've been, you know, starting to mix again and do some more stuff. So I got out of there for a while because, well, a lot of different factors. I wanted to see my kids grow up, and you know, normally making these records it's just a 24/7 job, and you know, It takes you away. You really don't get to do anything else, and I kind of wanted to, like, not do it for a while and get away from it, and so, you know, which seems to pay off, because now apparently I'm a legend. So, you know,
you always were. Oh, we got John Bush back. Are you back, John Bush?
Hey, I don't know what happened. I'm just standing in the same spot. I never even moved. But
That's
anyway,
funny.
yeah.
Well, it's funny, you know.
With what John's saying, though, I agree. You know, those bands were like playing like bands, and they had a new sound, and they had their own sound. And that's what makes it, you know, you can ask Mickey Most in England, you know, how to make a hit, and he'll tell you it has to have its own sound. You got to be able to hear 5 seconds of it and know exactly what that is, you know. And that's always been the case throughout history, regardless of whether it's pop or rap or metal or anything, is that it has to have it has to have an identity. And John's absolutely right. When the reason that the grunge thing took over was because it did have these identities, and that's what made the difference, you know, and that's why the whole paradigm changed, you know.
Well, let's go up to modern times, and we'll kind of wrap this up here. I know there's a couple new stuff, or over the last couple years, that you had done, Max, that I know David was involved with. Is it pronounced the Machinage and the Ethan Brosh albums, both in 2016?
Oh, Machinage, yeah.
Machinage, okay.
Yeah, I did that actually with those guys from Brazil. They sent me the album to mix, and then I guess Dave and Tom Hazard picked it up. And really, the thing that got me back into mixing again was Ethan Brosh called me up and said, "Are you the guy that did, you know, Wicked Sensation?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I want you to mix my record." So he sent me all his tracks, and we mixed that record, and then it sort of word got out a little bit, and I did the Machinage record. Then I did another band called Mean Streak from Sweden, Another band mix was a band called Volster, Volster, from Sweden. And just recently, of course, we did, just the end of last year, during last year, we did the Red Dragon Cartel thing with Jakey Lee.
Right.
And yeah, that turned out pretty good. So, I'm back mixing again now. I don't really have too much time to do the production stuff, but certainly I am doing mixing. Actually, I'm mixing something for David this weekend, or actually next week in the evenings. I'll be doing it. So Tom just sent me all the tracks. So I think that's going on your EP as well, isn't it, David?
Yes, it is. Yep, exactly. Yep, we're having some Max Norman mixes, which
That's awesome.
it was great because we got to reconnect. Tom and I put together this PBX Music Festival back in December down in Tampa, and it was designed to go back to when Bob Chiappardi had the Concrete Foundations forums and the New Music Seminar and CMJ and all these great conventions, and they're pretty much all gone away. So we're trying to recreate that, and it was just great. Mike Klink, Toby Wright, Max Norman, 3 producers I'd worked with in my career, all on the same panel, and on all big records, everything from Toby with Dystopia to Mike Klink with Rust in Peace, and then Max, of course, Rust in Peace to Euthanasia. So it was really an honor and a privilege to sit with, 3 men who helped change my life, and again, shape me as a musician and a recording artist. And that's why I remember Machinage, we signed them to EMP Label Group, and Tom called me and was just so excited. He goes, "Dude, you'll never guess who mixed it." I said, "Who?" He goes, "Max Norman." I said, "What? No way." So where's Max living these days? So it's been great. Max and I have reconnected, and funny, we had dinner at P.F. Chang's, I think, down in Tampa, and I mean, the stories were just flowing. And that was why that night after we walked back to the hotel, I said, "Max, you got to write a book, man. You've got the best stories, and you're funny as hell when you tell them. It's like you got to not only do the book, you got to do the audio book, which I'm sure will mix very well."
That'd be awesome.
Well, I'll let you mix it, David.
Exactly. Switch roles, right?
Yeah.
That's cool.
All right. Max, you did these 2 albums, and the one, as you mentioned, the Machinage, out on EMP, which is great, David. I'm so glad that you revamped Combat Records and you started this EMP label, and you're kind of going old school. I mean, you put out one of my favorite bands, Last Crack. I don't know if you had a chance to hear the new Last Crack album, John Bush. I know you guys toured back in the day. It's fantastic.
They had a record. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Absolutely awesome.
They were a good band.
Yeah.
Well, it's been great to have a partner. Just like being in a band, you have to have partnership. You have to have collaboration. You have to be a team, and that's what I have with Tom. Tom he's a fan. He's an industry guy himself. He calls me out. He'll work till 5 a.m. I see the timestamps on his emails, and he's a passionate lunatic for music, and I credit him, getting the ability to get Combat Records and launching the EMP Label Group and all the stuff that we do. And I think that Max, that Ethan Brosh record, I played on that. I think, right? Was that the one that I had played on?
I don't know.
There's one that I played on that because Ethan is a friend of mine, and I remember he came through. He's he's a Berkeley College student, and he and I become buddies. And I played on something for him. I don't know if that's the one you mixed or not, but it's funny. Just this whole conversation is just a mosaic narrative of all the different times and dates and places and people and all the things that, as the dates and times passes, the people don't, the people, we just always keep crossing paths and staying connected. And I don't know, probably for me and John as artists, and with Max, and you, Bob, you were one of the first guys I met when I met Dave and we started Megadeth. I remember you were one of the first guys.
That's right. We went to the beach with Patrick Scott, and we did that very first interview of Megadeth for a Headbanger.
Yeah. And it's really cool because, it's funny when the Murder in the Front Row movie came out a couple months ago, my other group, Metal Allegiance, John was there singing with us because we worked on a record together for Nuclear Blast last year, and we're there, and it hit me, John. I don't know if you felt it, but a lot of these other genres. The film premiered across the street at what used to be the Kabuki Theater, where Megadeth and Exodus had played back in 1985, and then we went across the street and we played our Metal Legion show at the Fillmore. And a lot of these other genres, the kind of the hippie genre, they've got the Fillmore, and they've got these places. That Sunset Strip still has the Whiskey and the Rainbow and the Troubadour and these places, but The venues that I grew up playing, Lemoore, the Waters Club in San Pedro, those venues are gone. All the venues are gone. We don't have even CBGB's, if you're a punk rocker, the CBGB brand is still out there, but the actual venue is not.
Sure.
So it's kind of like all we have in our genre, and not just thrash, especially thrash, but this kind of my age group in the genre is we have the stories and we have each other. We don't have a physical address like the Whiskey or the Fillmore, to go back and sort of relive time. So it's these conversations like this that keep us connected and keeps the folklore going, and hence the reason for the new Max Norman book. John, you're the next one. You got to get a book on. Your book is next.
Yeah.
You did narrate the Brian Slagle book, right, John?
I did actually the audio version of some of the narration and a lot of the interviews, and that was really, really a lot of fun and challenging because I had come up with all the names from the guys and Amon and Marth and pronounce them properly, and that was challenging. Yeah, but it was a really cool experience. It's funny, I just have to have certain things jarred in my memory.
Yeah. Well, you got the documentary coming out. Could you
never know.
Could you tell us about the documentary? I know a couple guys from the UK are working on this, the Armored Saint movie.
Well, we'll see. I mean, Russell Charrington is the name of the guy. He's a really, really big fan. He's a super cool guy. He had this he's like a film student, and he goes, I want to do this. So we said, well, if you do it, we'll be supportive and give you as many interviews and photos and whatever to do it, but it's your thing. Like we're not, co-doing this with you. Lo and behold, he ended up interviewing like Cliff Bernstein, and obviously he spoke to Max and Ron Fair and Ron Lafitte
and Metallica. He just interviewed
and the guys, and he even got to talk to James and Lars, which is shocking. So not just to be able to get that done. So I was quite impressed. So we'll see. The Armored Saint story is it's a unique one, and it's an interesting story. So we'll see what happens. I have low expectations, but if he can make it happen, it'd be real fun.
All right. And you are doing a few shows with UFO in October, correct? The Mega Cruise. Yeah.
So we're doing the Mega Cruise. We're playing with UFO. It should be real phil Mogg is probably one of my favorite singers of all time, and nothing beats Lights Out and Obsession as far as I'm concerned, as far as hard rock records go. And it'll be they're calling it a day after this. Paul Raymond passed away, which sucked, and so we're excited to do that. And me and Joey and we've been doing a bunch of demos. And Armored Saint will make a new record. I don't know who's gonna mix it quite yet, but we'll see. I mean, we have been writing, and our aspirations to get something out realistically. The way we move is pretty slow, but realistically, sometime next year. So it'll be cool, though. We're stoked on the music we're writing.
All right. David Ellefson, any updates on the Mega Cruise or I know you're working on a new album, obviously, with Dave, and we all, heard about his throat issue.
He put out his statements, and that's, like he said, I'll keep you posted. So that's from him personally. And so I'm going to just, I think, kind of defer all that stuff over to him. But, it's funny, even working on the new Megadeth album, which we're still doing, and it's something we can continue to work on behind the scenes, as much as we had to clear the calendar for any road work just so Dave can go through his treatments and recovery from that. We can still create and lay down tracks. And it's funny, the conversation that Max was talking about earlier, I found me and Kiko and Dirk got in a room and we're just jamming over some stuff. And there's a lot of fans that are asking for this Killing Is My Business and Euthanasia sounding new Megadeth album, right? They really like that. And, the new iPhone commercial, of course, is...
I love that.
Last Strikes Love to Death. Which
that's like it was made for Megadeth. It was almost
I know. And it's funny because that's song 1, side A, album 1, 1985, recorded in 1984. So, that's how old that is. And it's funny that album was recorded, all of us, me and Dave and Gar, in a room playing together. Just like Euthanasia was the four of us in a room playing together. So there's this real kind of... I find in metal, there's this real throwback right now, kind of a pushback against these very digital Pro Tools records where people want to really feel like they're listening to a band playing, not just, a perfectly produced record. And it's interesting because the three of us started jamming over some tunes one day. We're just kind of playing, just, jamming along. And it was like, holy shit, man, we are a freaking good band. And I told him, I said, you know what? This reminds me exactly of going in to do the Euthanasia record, where we can play really good together as a band. And Max, I told him all the stories about, how that developed. I mean, Euthanasia, we were a band. We'd made 2 albums together. We'd done 2 massive world tours together. So by the time we did Euthanasia, I mean, we were a machine. And Megadeth feels like that again now, because this lineup has done so much road work together. And creatively, there's sparks flying everywhere, man. I mean, it's really, there's a fire, and everybody's bringing great ideas to the table. And we're spending time in, Max, kind of like what we did with Countdown. We're spending time, Countdown and Euthanasia, I guess, we're spending time with the songs, going over, like you mentioned about Mutt Lange. When you listen to a part of the song over and over and over, you're like, get rid of that. Let's change a note there. Hey, let's redo this guitar harmony here. I mean, we're at that level on this new Megadeth album. And it really Dave even said, he goes, we walk in, we plug in, we record this stuff, and then we just go right out on tour. We never really take the time on these albums that we've done lately to really just kind of live with the songs, make sure they work. And, we did a couple records, the Risk album and the Super Collider album, which were 2, albums that didn't really connect very well. And a part of that reason is because we didn't have the time and didn't take the time to really develop them as 4 guys in a band. And I know Dave was very much wanting to do that on this record. He's like, look, the album's going to be done when it's done. We don't have to be in a hurry. It just needs to be great, and we'll put it out when it's ready. So that's the update on it. And quite honestly, Max, it's to me, it's a throwback to the records we made back in the 90s, which I'm thrilled, because we had good success with those albums.
All right.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
And Max, I know you're obviously you're back in action doing a lot of mixing. I know you're on Facebook. Is there do you welcome people to contact you if they have albums that they need mixed, or?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
all right.
They can find me on Facebook. I'm out there, so Yep, no problem.
All right. Well, I guess we should probably end this. We're over 2 hours in. We might have to make this a 2-parter, but I mean, we could go on forever. I mean, I've known, John and David since the early 80s. And of course, I knew of you, Max, ever since the Ozzy record. So it's just like, old friends talking old stories. And we might have to do a follow-up episode to this. But in the meantime, definitely catch Armored Saint and Megadeth out on the Mega Cruise. And I got to say, kudos again to Dave Mustaine for doing something so killer with this boat cruise. Because, I've said this before on my podcast. So many of these festivals you see have the same damn revolving bands, especially here in the U.S. Obviously, Europe has a lot more diverse metal festivals. But here in the U.S., you get the same bands on all these bills. And I love the fact that Dave has, brought in, Armored Saint, Raven, Death Angel, all these bands that, aren't on these other festivals. And I think it's going to be a great thing. So definitely check out the Mega Cruise in October. I know Armored Saint's doing a few other shows, and Megadeth, we all pray for Dave Mustaine to get better very soon. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to the new record and some new touring for Megadeth. Anything else before we close?
Well, I was happy to chat with Max Norman. I don't really know when the last time I spoke to you, Max, and it sounds like we just finished like a track from Delirious Nomad. That's how quickly it referred back. So great chatting with you, and Dave.
Yeah, great to talk
amazing,
to you, John. Absolutely, man. I'll see you soon, I'm sure. As soon as whenever you guys are over here on the East Coast, I'll come and see you. Sure.
That's
cool.
A great thing. I love working with Dave and Metal Allegiance, and it's been an incredible experience. And he's just an awesome human being. So
thank you, John.
And then there's Bob.
Yeah. David Ellefson, on your new record, John Bush does a vocal appearance on it, as you mentioned.
He does. If You Were God.
Yeah.
If a track rejected by Max Norman for Euthanasia. It's so funny because
I did my best Billy Idol.
Tom told me, he goes, you have to tell that story. And I was like, oh my God. And I said, oh my God, I'm going to be on a podcast with Bob, John, and Max. So it would be the perfect time to tell the story. And I was literally just yesterday writing out the lyrics If You Were God and just reliving the whole thing. And so it's awesome.
I love that.
It's had so many good moments where all of our paths have crossed, and this is yet another one. So thanks.
Right on. Yeah,
Very
thanks,
good.
guys.
Thanks a lot, Bob. Nice to talk to you, David. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah.
John, amazing to talk to you again.
All right.
I'll see you when you get into town.
Max.
I got to run up the street right now. I got another thing to do.
Thank you,
So,
Max. I appreciate
Bye,
it.
guys.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone.
Again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Subscribe and listen to all episodes by going to our pages on iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You can listen to all other episodes and access up-to-date information and news on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast by going to our website at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com. Email all comments, questions, and suggestions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com.